Hello, I'm Nick Reveles, and this is OperaTalk. My subject today is Hansel and Gretel, the opera composed by Englebert Humperdinck.
Lonely is a man without love.
No, not that Englebert Humperdinck, but the one who was a German composer active in the latter part of the 19th century. This is one of those pieces that's always been associated with Christmas, although there's nothing particularly Christmassy about it, except the appearance of a gingerbread cottage at the end of the opera in a magic forest, very much like this one. The idea of performing it during Christmas comes from the very first performance of Hansel and Gretel, which was in Weimar, Germany on December 23rd, 1893. Well, theater companies have their Christmas carols, ballet companies have the Nutcracker, opera companies have Hansel and Gretel. You might ask yourself, well, why do Hansel and Gretel outside of Christmas time, if that's the traditional time of performing it? Well, there are many qualities about this work that make it truly great. Certainly the story is familiar to us. Many of us heard this story at our mother's knees when we were 3 or 4 years old, and we could probably relate the story of Hansel and Gretel detail by detail. And some of the music is familiar too. The evening hymn that the children sing deep in the woods in the second act is familiar, and by the time this half hour is over, I'm sure you'll realize that many of the folk tunes and folk-like melodies that Humperdinck uses in the score are familiar to you as well. Now, just because a work is familiar to us, perhaps even overly familiar to us, doesn't mean that the music, the opera, isn't great. In fact, the greatest staples of the operatic repertory, Aida, Carmen, La Bohème, Madame Butterfly, are very familiar to us. Well, they're familiar to us because they're great pieces of work. They're masterpieces. Well, Hansel and Gretel is a minor masterpiece. It's a wonderful work filled with gorgeous tunes, simple ideas, a simple story that everybody knows. It makes it, of course, a perfect vehicle for introducing children to opera. And the point I'm going to try and make with you is that it's also good for adults, a very good introduction to opera for adults. Now, we're performing this opera in April in a new production by Maurice Sendak, the illustrator and author of Where the Wild Things Are and other wonderful award-winning children's books. But what are we to make of an opera like this that is usually done at Christmas time and that we're performing in the regular international season? What are we to make of the music created towards the end of the 19th century after that ferment of culture and folklore and mythology that was occurring in Germany at the time? And what do we make of the music itself? Well, we've got to go back about 50 years before the writing of Hansel and Gretel to answer some of those questions and talk about the man who revolutionized German opera in the mid-19th century and was an overpowering influence on Englebert Humperdinck. That person, that composer, was Richard Wagner. Inarguably, the largest presence in the world of opera in the latter part of the 19th century was German composer Richard Wagner. He's often thought of as a revolutionary, but in fact, all of the things that make Wagner's music unique were fashioned by older composers: Mozart, Beethoven, Carl Maria von Weber, Heinrich Marschner. But even with his very first operas, Die Feen and Das Liebesverbot, we see a larger-than-life personality taking proven operatic compositional devices and making them his own. Highly chromatic harmony, breaking down the artificial separation between dialogue and musical numbers, using a larger orchestra than had ever been tried before. His first great artistic success was The Flying Dutchman, a lengthy but beautiful work about a Dutch sea captain condemned to sail the seas for all eternity, searching for redemption. The opera's score evokes the tempestuous ocean as well as the tempest of emotion within the heart of Zenta, the woman who comes to love the mysterious Dutchman. This opera was quickly followed by Tannhäuser and Lohengrin, beginning a lifelong obsession with German mythology and legend. This was an era of extreme nationalism, and in the ferment that was the German political scene of the 1840s and 50s, Wagner's operas became rallying points for those who saw German art and culture as the dominating social force in the 19th century. Wagner's magnum opus was Der Ring des Nibelungen, a sprawling masterpiece covering 4 full evenings of music drama. This 17-hour epic was the climax of Wagner's obsession with German mythology, dealing with the fate of the ancient Teutonic gods, their tainted construction of Valhalla, their ancestral home, and the monumental struggle for ultimate power in the form of a magic gold ring. It was in this tetralogy that Wagner reached the pinnacle of what he called Gesamtkunstwerk, the complete work of art. Great poetry, great music, great scenic design, great theater, all rolled into one sacred ritual experience. It was also in this work that Wagner fully exploited the compositional device of the leitmotif. Now, in order to understand Wagner's greatest contribution to 19th century German opera, we have to understand the concept of the leitmotif. Leitmotif translated into English is leading motive, and what that is a short melodic germ or theme which Wagner uses to attach symbolically to characters in the opera, objects, emotional states, psychological states, even environments and atmospheres that change and shift throughout this 17-hour epic of The Ring. Let me give you an example of what I mean. At the very beginning of this opera, in the part that he entitled Das Rheingold, 3 Rhine maidens are swimming around in the Rhine protecting a large heap of gold, and that gold is very, very powerful. When they sing a hymn to the gold, Rheingold, Rheingold, radiant joy, leuchtende Lust, this is the leitmotif that you get. It's a very heroic theme, very heroic leitmotif, and every time that the Rhine maidens or anyone else refers to the gold, we get a variation of that thematic idea. Here's another wonderful leitmotif that Wagner uses in The Ring. The fortress of the gods, built by the king of the gods, Wotan by name. The first time we see it is in the second scene of the Rheingold, and it's up there backstage, usually a beautiful painting or a set of this fortress, magnificent castle up in the clouds. But it's been built on deception. We'll talk a little bit more about that again. But the first time we see it, we get this wonderful leitmotif. Well, that leitmotif is noble and magnificent. It moves rather like a German chorale or a hymn. It's the kind of device that Wagner often uses throughout all of his operas in order to get that nobility across. Well, listen to what happens the first time that the gold is used for evil purposes. A dwarf, an evil dwarf named Alberic, has stolen the gold and fashioned a gold ring out of it, and he uses it for destruction. The first time that happens, we get a combination of those two ideas, Rheingold and Valhalla. But by changing a few notes, and particularly the harmony, we get something very sinister indeed. Well, simply using those two ideas, Wagner has come up with a new idea in order to get across the concept of the evil use of the gold. Well, all of Wagner's operas are put together with hundreds of melodic ideas, these leitmotifs. And every composer after Wagner, especially German composers like Richard Strauss and Engelbert Humperdinck, had to decide what they would do with their own operas. Would they follow the leitmotif system or ignore it and come up with something new? But before we talk about the music of Hansel and Gretel and Engelbert Humperdinck in general, let's take a little bit of a detour and talk about the Brothers Grimm. Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm, two brothers, were born in the late 18th century in the Hesse-Kassel area of Germany. They both lived well beyond the midpoint of the 19th century, and their first collection of stories, called Märchen in German, were published in 1812. In 1829, they were translated into English and were published in Great Britain. This proved to be a watershed event in literary history because it was the first time that normal children's stories like these, that were usually thought of as the purview of the nanny and the nursery, were read by everybody. They became, in fact, great gifts for people to give to each other, to read and to tell and retell over and over again. Many of these great stories were just in the air in that part of Germany, and all that the Grimm brothers had to do was talk to their relatives and their neighbors and friends to give them some of these stories. Many of the stories had variations in them, and they worked very hard as editors to make one story out of each group of tales that they would hear. In fact, one of the stories, Hansel and Gretel, was originally told to them by a very young girl whose name was Dortchen Wild. Miss Wild eventually became Wilhelm Grimm's wife. The story Hansel and Gretel comes from a strain of folklore in Northern Europe in which little children outwit an ogre or a giant or a witch and come out on top at the end. The story itself is a little bit different from the stories we have it in the opera. In fact, the librettist of Humperdinck's opera, Hansel and Gretel, decided to leave out the most painful part of the story. And that is that the parents are really a father who has two children from a previous marriage and a rather evil stepmother. The stepmother, because the family is starving, insists that the father take the children out into the deepest part of the woods and leave them simply because she can't afford to feed them anymore. And they do this, drag Hansel and Gretel out to the center of the woods. Hansel is smart enough to drop white pebbles along the way so that he'll be able to find his way back. The parents leave the children there, and the stepmother is tremendously frustrated and extremely upset when, the next morning, the children show up back at the doorstep. They take them out to the woods a second time. This time, Hansel has only bread, little breadcrumbs to drop behind him, and of course the animals of the forest eat the bread, and the children this time are indeed lost in this mysterious wood. We'll talk about abandonment issues, and it's a really scary thing for kids. The rest of the story is very much told straightforwardly in the opera. The encounter with the witch, the dream pantomime with the 14 guardian angels who come down to protect the children. And then there's a slight difference in the end. In the original Grimm story, at the end, only the father returns to the forest to happily greet his children and welcome them back into his loving arms. The stepmother, in the ensuing 2 or 3 days that the children have been missing, has died. I find it very interesting that both the witch and the stepmother have died in the original story. In the opera Hansel and Gretel, however, it's a happy ending with everybody all the way around. The mother, the father come back, embrace the children, and all's well. Fairy tales are a wonderful way for human beings to deal with difficult issues that are hard to talk about in the concrete. Because after all, the tales give us a sense of distance that only fantasy can give us when dealing with these issues. After all, Hansel and Gretel deals with abandonment, transformation, love, and unconditional love of children, even redemption. And what do some of these things in this story symbolize? The forest, for instance. Does it symbolize mystery and danger and adventure? Perhaps. The witch, is she a symbol of pure evil, Or is she perhaps a more benign symbol of some kind of substantial transformation? Because after all, what she wants to do with the children is turn them into gingerbread and, in other words, transform them into something else and consume them, eat them. What about the two houses that are in this story? We have a cottage at the beginning where this poor family lives with the two children, and we have a gingerbread cottage at the end, the house of the witch. Perhaps the first one symbolizes imperfect relationships, the dysfunctional family. The later one, the gingerbread cottage, which is the cottage that only the witch can come in and out of alive, perhaps that symbolizes a distant tomorrow, a future that we don't know yet. It's very mysterious to us. Well, whatever the meanings of these symbols, they're certainly there, they're certainly rich. The wonderful thing about symbolism is that the more you try to pin it down, the more those symbols elude you and the richer they become. This is certainly part of the thing that attracted Englebert Humperdinck to write the opera in the first place. So let's talk a little bit about this wonderful composer. Englebert Humperdinck was born in Siegburg, Germany in 1854. He began piano lessons at the tender age of 7 and began actually composing at the age of 14, very much like Richard Wagner before him. He was a precocious teenager. He attended the Cologne Conservatory, and in 1873 he had a mind-changing, a soul-searing experience, hearing Richard Wagner conduct some of his own works in orchestra in Cologne. Richard Wagner was in Cologne to raise money for the Bayreuth Festival. And Bayreuth was that small Bavarian town that Wagner chose to build a monumental theater in which to produce all of his great operas. Well, this 1873 experience of the young Humperdinck was just so exciting and so wonderful, he decided to dedicate his life to composition thereafter. The idea for the writing of the opera Hansel and Gretel came originally from Humperdinck's sister, Adelaide Wette. Now, she had a relatively big family, and they loved to perform little musicals and family theatricals. And she sent some nursery rhymes to Humperdinck, asking him to set them to music for one of these theatricals. Well, she was so delighted with the result that she asked him to write a Singspiel for her children. Now, a Singspiel is a little play with some spoken dialogue, and some music. And the story was to be Hansel and Gretel. At one point, Humperdinck went to Bayreuth to visit the widow of Richard Wagner, Cosima, who was, by the way, the daughter of Franz Liszt. And in conversation with her, he brought up the idea of writing a comic opera in German. She probed him with some thought-provoking questions, and finally he realized that he could probably take that little Singspiel that he wrote for his family and expand it into a grand opera for a large orchestra, operatic voices, and chorus. Well, it took him a long time to eventually get to it, and in fact, it took him 2 years to orchestrate the piece. But he finally did it, wrote it up in manuscript, and sent 50 manuscripts out of the piece to some of his closest colleagues, including Richard Strauss, the great conductor and composer. And he so loved this work that he demanded to be the first one to conduct it. And indeed, on December 23, 1893, he did. Within a few years, every opera house in Europe and America was clamoring to do Hansel and Gretel. Let's talk now a little bit about the music of Englebert Humperdinck's Hansel and Gretel and see exactly what makes it tick. Well, first we have to understand that Humperdinck was greatly influenced by Wagner, but we really can't strictly call Hansel and Gretel a Wagnerian opera. Hansel and Gretel seems to go back to an earlier period of German Romantic opera, around the time that Wagner began writing, when fairy tales and mythology were in the air. He wants something simpler, and in fact he uses actual folk songs within the fabric of his work, and he makes those folk songs, those tunes, act as leitmotifs throughout the work. Let me give you an example. Hansel and Gretel, in fact, the whole opera begins with a traditional German folk song. This is not by Humperdinck, but he uses it to describe the two children, Hansel and Gretel, playing in their house. This is typical of German folk music in that it uses a very short range, just 6 notes. Later on in the opera, Humperdinck uses yet another traditional German folk tune, Ein Männlein steht im Walde ganz. And then, of course, he uses that tune within the fabric of the piece. There are lots of other melodies in Hansel and Gretel which are like folk tunes but aren't actual authentic German folk tunes. One occurs upon the entrance of the father coming into the house bringing a shopping cart full of food to his starving family. Wonderful, glorious melody, really, attached to the father. Now, let's go back to Susie, Little Susie, which is the very first folk tune that he uses in the opera. One of the most important rhythmic elements of that tune is this little turn at the very beginning. In the opera, when the mother comes into the house and, because she's fighting with Hansel and Gretel, spills the milk that she was going to serve them for dinner, she gets very angry and frustrated and then sends them out into the forest, where they get lost, of course. She sends them out to find strawberries, so at least they'll have something to eat. She sits down at the dining room table and puts her head in her hands and cries. She laments about her state in life, the fact that she has these 2 children, she doesn't know how to feed them, she has no money, the husband hasn't been home in a long time, hasn't brought any food home. We get a variation of that children's folk song in the accompaniment in the orchestra under this lament. Listen. That little turn comes from that simple little folk song. This is Humperdinck's treatment of the leitmotif. It's a little more subtle, perhaps, not quite as developed as Wagner's use of leitmotifs, but nonetheless it is used. One more idea that he gets from Wagner is the use of rhythmic leitmotifs. For instance, when the children see the gingerbread cottage for the first time, it's enticing to them. They want to go up to it and pick the bits of candy off of it and eat it, and they want to eat the walls, which are made out of gingerbread. Humperdinck uses a barcarolle rhythm underneath. A barcarolle is the song that gondoliers sing in gondolas in Venice. And remember, that's where Humperdinck meets Wagner for the first time. So he spent a lot of time in Venice and got that barcarolle rhythm in his soul. He uses that lilting rhythm in order to describe the enticing feeling that they get from the house. There's one more instance of the use of a dance rhythm in this piece that's very entertaining and very interesting, and that's the fact that when the witch is finally pushed into the oven at the end of the opera and killed by Hansel and Gretel, they dance a waltz. Well, can you think of a better thing to celebrate the killing of an ogre or a witch than a waltz? Well, what a wonderful way to celebrate the children dancing a waltz around the dead body of the witch in the gingerbread cottage. There's one more rhythmic idea, and that's the idea that Wagner often uses in his own works to get across a noble or prayerful idea. And that is, of course, the famous evening hymn that the children sing in the middle of the forest before they go to sleep. I hope you agree that Hansel and Gretel is an opera well worth performing, as well as an opera worth going out and getting a good recording of. Now, there's no lack of wonderful recordings of this opera. They're all spaciously recorded with beautiful voices. I want to single out just 3 of them. First of all, a performance on EMI Angel Records, and that is this performance conducted by Jeffrey Tate. There's also a performance conducted by Donald Runnicles, who often conducts at the San Francisco Opera. And then finally, my favorite recording of Hansel and Gretel, and that is this one from Sony CBS Classics, and I love it so much because Frederica von Stade and Ileana Kotrubash are the 2 children, Hansel and Gretel. A wonderful performance conducted by Sir John Pritchard. I hope you agree that Hansel and Gretel is not just an opera for children. It's for adults as well. Its themes and issues are about things that we deal with every day in our lives as human beings. I'm sure it's a piece that you'll enjoy immensely when we perform it. I'm Nick Reveles, and I'll see you at the opera.